In the 1930s, long before the Second World War reached its height, Austria and Italy became theaters of what would later be recognized as the People's War, a struggle not only against foreign occupation, but also against fascist systems that exploited their own people. In this segment, we start with Austria in 1934, when workers in Vienna rose up against a fascist dictatorship determined to crush their rights under the pretense of upholding capitalist order. Even though this rebellion was harshly quelled, it stood as one of the earliest instances of armed resistance to fascism in Europe, an early warning of the conflicts that were to come. We'll look at how Austria's internal divisions, with some groups seeking union with Mussolini, while others aligned with Hitler, culminated in the Anschluss in 1938, leaving Austrian workers feeling isolated and betrayed as Nazi control took hold. Next, we turn our attention to Italy, the birthplace of fascism. Here, a lengthy history of repression sparked widespread strikes, partisan uprisings, and a people's war that linked the fight for national freedom to a deeper struggle for social justice. Italian workers, peasants, and partisans took on both the Nazis and Mussolini's puppet government, while also facing betrayal from their own elites and the Allied powers, who aimed to curb the revolution instead of backing it. By the end of this segment, you'll understand how the stories of Austria and Italy intertwine, illustrating the clash between the hopes of popular resistance and the stark realities of dictatorship, imperial agendas, and class interests that influenced the trajectory of Europe's anti-fascist movements for years. Before Spain, Austria experienced the initial confrontations of the People's War when, in 1934, the working class in Vienna revolted against fascist authority. This uprising stemmed from the aftermath of the Austrian Empire's collapse following the First World War and the Wall Street crash. The ruling class found itself deeply divided on how to act. One faction supported Anschluss, yielding to Hitler's demand for a merger, while another believed that independence could still be achieved by looking to Mussolini's Italy as a counterbalance to German power. This latter group, known as the Austro-Fascists, employed tactics from Italy, dissolved parliament, and outlawed strikes. The division between these factions ran deep, leading pro-Nazi elements to murder the Austro-Fascist Chancellor Dollfuss in a bid for control. Schuschnigg, Dollfuss's successor, found himself in a perilous situation despite his shortcomings. Though they had their differences, both factions saw that the fragility of Austrian capitalism required a harsher use of labor under dictatorship. Resistance sparked on February 12, 1934, as workers in Vienna took to the streets with the rallying cry, "Strike fascism down before it crushes you. Workers, arm yourselves." This ignited 4 days of intense conflict, during which the army bombed civilian areas, ultimately quelling the uprising. One participant reflected on the moment, stating, "Even in defeat, the February struggle held great historical importance beyond Austria." The German working class had yielded to Hitler without struggle, but for the first time, workers were actively fighting back against fascism, armed and determined. They lit a beacon. Despite the harsh response, the spirit of resistance remained. The underground union publication Gewerkschaft reported strikes throughout various industries in August and September of 1937, highlighting a rising defiance against the regime. Austro-fascism suffered a significant setback when Italy joined the Rome-Berlin axis, enabling Hitler to proceed with his ambitions. In 1938, he summoned Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat, demanding annexation. The stakes were high. A conservative historian remarked that even just 24 hours of opposition, a general strike, or mass protests could have incited a united defense. Workers' representatives were pushing for exactly that. Just 10 days before the Anschluss, they took a bold step to emerge from hiding, urging Schuschnigg to rally public resistance against Nazism. All they asked for was the release of leftist political prisoners and the repeal of anti-union laws. However, Schuschnigg recalled a significant comment from Hitler during their meeting. "Do you want to make another Spain of Austria?" He chose to disregard cooperation with the workers' leaders, viewing it as a partnership with Bolsheviks. This choice left his regime exposed and unable to defend itself. On March 12, 1938, Hitler's forces rolled across the border. One leftist activist noted that workers were ready to fight to the death for Austria's freedom. They faced off against police who mocked them, asking, "Why are you still protesting? Schuschnigg has already stepped down." This crushed any lingering hopes for a united resistance. The depth of surrender became clear when it was revealed that, unlike other nations occupied by Germany, Austria had no government in exile. Even Karl Renner, leader of the Socialist Party, endorsed a yes vote in the referendum organized by Hitler for annexation, much to the dismay of many within his party. Nonetheless, a people's war against Nazism began to form, though it was driven by a small group leading on behalf of the masses rather than a collective movement. Following Renner's betrayal, the once powerful Socialist Party splintered. The breakaway group, the Revolutionary Socialists, gathered around veteran Otto Bauer and attracted some members, but most chose to align with the Austrian Communist Party. In fact, 6 out of 7 communist resistors were former socialists, comprising 3/4 of those prosecuted for political dissent. As a historian pointed out, from a notable sample of active members in various underground resistance groups, almost every Austrian resisting the Nazis was linked to the Communist Party. The remaining opposition often found itself associated with the Catholic Church. The only significant protest against Nazism after the annexation took place in October 1938, rallying around the slogan, "Our Führer is Christ," rather than Hitler. Despite acts of remarkable bravery, Austrian resistance remained disjointed and weak. A prime example was the O5 organization, which sought to connect with the Allies as the war wound down. Like the conservative opposition in Germany, its history was disheartening. It included many Austro-fascists and monarchists who kept left-leaning members sidelined. Only partisans in Carinthia province, primarily Slovenians backed by Tito's forces in Yugoslavia, and the working-class resistance presented real challenges to the Nazis. Those standing against Nazism also faced the added hurdle of Allied policies. In 1943, the foreign ministers of the United States, Russia, and Britain issued a joint statement declaring, "Austria was the first free land to fall victim to Hitler's aggression." They might have believed this would motivate Austria to separate from Germany, yet their position had serious long-term consequences. One observer noted, "You offered us a historical escape, and we seized it." Granting victim status to all Austrians meant that after the war, former Austro-fascists and Nazis were seen the same as those who resisted fascism, despite the huge number of the former compared to the latter. Investigators discovered that prior to the Anschluss, there were 100,000 Nazi members in Austria, and this figure skyrocketed to 700,000 by 1945. Meanwhile, 5,000 Austrian resistance fighters lost their lives, and 100,000 were arrested during this period. Before 1949, when ex-Nazi party members gained the right to vote and began to sway elections, prominent politicians leaned on the Allies' victim theory to minimize fascist crimes. In 1945, the country's foreign minister sought to absolve local Nazis by claiming that the persecution of Jews was entirely orchestrated and executed by the German authorities. Renner, who became chancellor with Russian backing, asserted that Austrian anti-Semitism had never been very aggressive. Those who were humiliated in 1938, forced to scrub the streets of Vienna with toothbrushes, would likely dispute this, but the 70,000 Austrian Jews who died in gas chambers had no voice. With such leaders at the helm, it's not surprising that a 1946 poll revealed 46% of Austrians were opposed to the return of the few Jewish survivors. This response had a certain chilling rationale. Many pro-Nazi Austrians had gained from the expropriation of Jewish homes and property. As the Wehrmacht disbanded, thousands of Hitler's soldiers came back to Austria as tragic victims, while resistance fighters fought for recognition and often faced significant obstacles in returning home. Oral histories from Austrian resistors illustrate numerous instances of the United States delaying their repatriation, mainly due to associations with communism. Upon returning, they bore the stigma of outcasts. A significant moment occurred during the dedication of a monument to the fallen, when the highest-ranking army officer declined to link the ceremony to the memory of resistance fighters, declaring that such people died as oath breakers and do not belong at this monument. Denazification efforts in Austria were far from complete. In the amnesty of 1948, 90% of those investigated avoided repercussions. Unlike Germany, Austria did not have a thorough re-education process after the war, leading to serious consequences. In 1983, a man linked to the deaths of about 10,000 civilians in Ukraine was stopped from becoming president of the parliament only due to a petition campaign. Even more startling was the election of Kurt Waldheim as president in 1986, despite accusations of war crimes against him by the Yugoslavs and being named a suspected war criminal in the United States. Two Austrian resistors shared how anti-fascists viewed the outcome of the Second World War. Josef Hindels, a prominent trade union leader who fled to Sweden, expressed his mixed feelings. "I felt great joy at Hitler's defeat and liberation, but was also very disappointed. I wanted to return home right away, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get permission to go back to Austria in 1945. It took Kreisky's significant efforts in 1946 before I finally got that permission. That was my first letdown. The second was the establishment of a provisional government in Austria led by Karl Renner, which I couldn't accept. I saw Renner as the guy who welcomed Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938. To me, he was politically done." Bruno Furch, who was released from a concentration camp in 1945, shared that there was a truly terrible game being played between the two major parties in Austria. To be clear, they took advantage of the legacy of Nazi rule and fascism to advance their Cold War battles in the West. They used anti-communism and anti-Soviet sentiment for their own gain, keeping that legacy alive, if not in power. It wasn't just about winning over 600,000 Nazi party members, though that was part of it later in 1949. The maneuvering began in 1945. It was more than just votes. It was about grabbing that power right from the start. In one housing estate, a young Jewish comrade returned from exile in England in 1946. But sadly, he took his own life. His love for the daughter of a prominent socialist official met fierce resistance from her parents, who disapproved of their relationship and marriage because he was Jewish. The young man struggled to grasp how, after defeating Hitler, such overt anti-Semitism could still exist among the leadership of the newly revitalized Socialist Party. It's difficult to imagine a starker contrast between imperialism's ambitions and the goals of anti-fascism. The Allies' readiness to collaborate with the pre-Anschluss Austro-fascists and former Nazis during the Cold War left a deep stain on Austrian politics for many years. A key characteristic of People's War, in contrast to traditional warfare, is its fusion of social aspirations for equality and liberation with political goals like national sovereignty and democracy. This was especially clear in Italy, where the working-class struggle was more pronounced than in other regions. One reason for this is that fascism originated in Italy, so resistance grew not only in response to foreign invasion, but also over decades against an unpopular social system closely tied to capitalism since 1922. Business and finance supplied 74% of fascist funding, and in return, Mussolini crushed the unions and enforced severe wage cuts in 1927, 1930, and 1934. His regime, while not as oppressive as Hitler's, still condemned 17,000 political opponents to internal exile, kept 60,000 under strict surveillance, and handed down a total of 28,000 years of hard labor sentences from 1926 to 1943, with workers making up 85% of those convictions. Socialist leader Matteotti was murdered, and Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, suffered in prison until his release, only to die shortly afterward. Some argue that a persistent spirit of resistance lived on in popular culture, but before the Second World War, this did not translate into active defiance. The war altered everything. Italy's role was anything but simple. Spriano describes how Mussolini's concerns about Italy's capacity to withstand a major conflict were dismissed by the ruling class. Eager to seize what they anticipated would be a swift and decisive victory, they overlooked his doubts after witnessing Blitzkrieg's success. The war brought real benefits to the ruling elite. By 1942, Engineers were working 60 hours a week, and Fiat stock jumped by 62%. The director reveled in the impressive Japanese victories across the Pacific and the inclusion of wealthy territories in Russia into the European Axis economy, which hinted at expanded production and larger markets. However, Italy's grand ambitions were ultimately derailed by the Allies, much like Germany and Japan faced. It wasn't until 1945, following a dramatic display of force, that Japan was brought to defeat, while Mussolini's regime fell 2 years earlier. What led to its fragility? One factor was Italy's gross national product, which was only a third of Germany's, making its army more susceptible to defeat in the struggle among empires. More critically, the regime faced internal erosion due to a popular uprising. Between 1938 and 1945, the cost of living surged 20-fold. With poor rationing on one side and outrageous black market prices on the other, it was no surprise that many of Turin's workforce, numbering 150,000, lost between 22 to 33 pounds. Gradually, the divide narrowed between a small, politically active group of resistors and the larger masses. This became apparent in the spring of 1943 when strikes broke out in the northern industrial region. Turin stood at the center of this uprising, where thriving war production in large factories fostered a unified sense of strength. Meanwhile, Allied bombings had devastated 25,000 homes, and the government failed to provide adequate air raid shelters. The blend of confidence and desperation ignited strike actions, irrespective of the dangers of opposing fascism, especially during wartime. A leaflet from January 1943 echoed the sentiments of the era. For food and freedom, down with the 12-hour workday in this brutal war. We demand Mussolini's ousting. We are fighting for peace and our nation's sovereignty. We want wage increases that are actually fulfilled. Action, strike, struggle, these are our only means of survival. Strike, strike, strike. Such calls had a powerful impact. During the winter of 1942 to 1943, the frequency of work stoppages surged from 2 to 5 each month. Then, on March 5th, 21,000 workers at Fiat Mirafiori heeded the appeal from a group of 80 communists and initiated a strike, despite management silencing the factory siren that normally indicated action. Walkouts rapidly spread throughout Turin and beyond. By March 15th, the movement had expanded to encompass 100,000 people, and by the month's end, every factory in Piedmont had closed its doors. Mussolini was shocked by the widespread discontent towards fascism and had to make significant concessions. He acknowledged that this truly unpleasant and regrettable situation has suddenly set us back 20 years. In February, following his defeat at Stalingrad a month earlier, Hitler recognized the gravity of the situation. He characterized it as unthinkable that such a multitude could strike without intervention. I firmly believe that anyone who shows even the slightest weakness is doomed. His prediction turned out to be accurate. The strike in Turin marked the first major walkout in 20 years, arguably the most crucial event of the global conflict. The blow it dealt to fascism aligned with the Anglo-American landing in Sicily on July 10, 1943. Panic gripped the establishment. After 2 decades of reaping the benefits of fascism, that very connection had become a dangerous liability, stirring potential revolution or provoking the advancing Allies. In an effort to navigate the crisis, the Italian government sought to negotiate an exit from the war with the Germans in exchange for giving up its Balkan acquisitions, but the Germans refused. In desperation, the government chose to publicly distance itself from Mussolini while quietly pursuing an armistice with the Allies. The fascist Grand Council voted 19-7 in favor of deposing and arresting Mussolini. The ruling class hoped this change would be merely cosmetic. Industrialist Pirelli initiated discussions with the Allies, suggesting that the monarchy, the crown, the church, the army, and the leaders of the economy would remain in control. However, there was a significant complication. It was King Vittorio Emanuele III who had appointed Mussolini as dictator back in 1922. Mussolini had crafted a narrative of seizing power in a dramatic coup during which 3,000 martyrs supposedly perished, referred to as the March on Rome. Yet that story was a fabrication. As one observer noted, Only when everything was settled did the so-called March on Rome unfold. Some advisors had urged the king to use state power against Mussolini's antics, but he openly disregarded their pleas, declaring, "I want all Italians to know that I did not sign any decree for a state of siege." This decision ultimately worked in his favor. With Mussolini as his prime minister, Vittorio Emanuele could proudly claim titles like Emperor of Ethiopia and King of Albania. Even after Mussolini was officially removed, the king insisted that fascism cannot be dismantled all at once. It must be gradually modified to eliminate elements harmful to the nation. His new prime minister, Marshal Badoglio, had questionable anti-fascist credentials too. He had supported Mussolini fervently, which earned him a promotion and the title Duke of Addis Ababa. If the Second World War was indeed a battle against fascism, then the so-called shift in the Italian government was merely a facade. Yet, the Allied powers welcomed the king and Badoglio with open arms. Their acceptance stemmed from a lack of ideological bias against those linked to the fascist regime. The Anglo-Americans shared the Italian elite's fear of revolution and were willing to overlook previous misdeeds as long as Italy stepped away from the rival imperialist coalition. In fact, the US had reached out to the king both before and after Italy entered the Second World War. Churchill had admired Mussolini since 1927, and his views remained unchanged, even in 1943, when he dismissed criticisms about collaborating with those who had supported Mussolini. The king had unexpected allies as well. When the US voiced concerns about his ability to maintain authority, Russia rushed to grant him full diplomatic recognition, becoming the first Allied power to do so. The demonstrators who celebrated Mussolini's downfall on July 25, 1943, were unaware of these troubling political machinations. As they tore down the symbols of dictatorship, they thought they were witnessing the end of fascism and war. Their celebration was premature. The government directed newspapers to steer clear of criticizing the previous regime or the war, and to approach their German ally with caution. They were cautioned against demanding the release of political prisoners. Badoglio, acting as military governor of Italy, declared that it was essential to act swiftly to prevent the current enthusiasm from spiraling into a communist or subversive uprising. In a scenario reminiscent of ancient Athens, the military and police were instructed to face the celebratory crowds with a readiness for combat, opening fire from afar and employing mortars and artillery as if targeting enemy forces. During a peaceful demonstration in Reggio Emilia calling for the expulsion of German troops, 11 people were killed by machine gun fire. In Bari, the death toll climbed to 19. While Italy's elite debated which imperialist faction would serve them best, they knew who their true adversary was. In March 1943, Hitler reprimanded the Italian government for its perceived weakness, while 5 months later, Churchill commended the brutal actions of a regime branding itself as post-fascist. Armed forces were sent to disperse communist rallies in cities like Turin and Milan. 2 decades of fascism had decimated the middle class, creating a chasm between the king and the patriots aligned with him, alongside rampant Bolshevism. The Allied press couldn't help but point out the blatant hypocrisy. The BBC ridiculed the Italian government for its failure to eradicate fascism, while America's Life magazine warned that the regime seemed intent on distancing itself from Mussolini and its German allies, all while trying to maintain its power. This shift suggested a move from pro-German fascism to a posture more favorable to the Allies. The fascist leaders were taken aback by Darlan's sudden change. Government crackdowns were met with strikes demanding peace, improved wages, the removal of fascists, and the freeing of political prisoners. Some soldiers even mutinied, refusing to fire their weapons. Nazi Germany observed with concern as events unfolded, preparing 8 Wehrmacht divisions in the north to take charge. The PCI recognized the looming threat, and in August 1943, called on Italians to prepare for possible German intervention by uniting the people and the military, directly countering the government's attempts to salvage fascism. Badoglio's only response to the German menace was to inspire the public, yet he approached them as if they were the enemy. By disregarding the potential for a people's war, Badoglio found himself ill-equipped to maneuver between the clashing imperialist factions, hoping that one would counterbalance the other. As he quietly negotiated a peace treaty with the Anglo-Americans pushing in from the south, he sought ongoing support from the Germans in the north, cautioning Ribbentrop that his government's collapse would result in a Bolshevik regime. The Nazi foreign minister also feared that power could shift to those with leftist ideologies. Without a peace agreement, and caught in the tightening grip of imperialist forces, the Italian people faced tremendous hardship. Allied bombings ravaged the country, with 220,000 residents of Milan displaced in just 5 days in August 1943. Meanwhile, the Germans tightened their grip. Ultimately, the government's duplicity couldn't endure. On September 8th, General Eisenhower, frustrated by Badoglio's delays, declared the armistice that the Italian government had negotiated with the Allies. In a surprising move, Badoglio continued to play both sides, proclaiming, "We will fight whoever attacks us," without specifying anyone. Another military order was far more direct. Under no circumstances should you initiate hostilities against German troops. This ambiguity left Italy's military unprepared for the German counterattack. As the German army launched its offensive, the king, Badoglio, and military ministers fled south, seeking refuge with the Allies. With no clear orders other than to avoid confrontation, Italy's army of 1 million was rapidly dismantled. 615,000 soldiers were sent to concentration camps, and 30,000 lost their lives. Even though the king ultimately sided with the Allies, his earlier actions mirrored the betrayal of an entire governing class, influencing the fate of the monarchy post-war. Northern Italy now bore the full weight of German wartime economic policies, designed to shift the financial burdens of the Nazi war effort onto the occupied territories. The Nazis extracted 84 billion lira from Italy, part of an annual income of 130 billion lira. Mussolini was turned into a scapegoat in this scenario, rescued in a bold commando operation, and placed in charge of a puppet government known as the Republic of Salo. From that point on, resistance fighters labeled their adversaries as Nazi fascist. After ravaging the country, the Nazis insisted on 3 things: its industrial output, no distractions from the battle against the Allied forces moving up from the south, and manpower to fuel their war efforts. Yet, the resilience of workers and peasants in the north thwarted these demands. Ginsburg of the Action Party articulated the difference between this people's war and an imperialist conflict, noting that the formal declaration of war by the king and Badoglio amounted to little more than an empty gesture, failing to alter the real situation on the ground. The genuine fight against Nazi Germany ignited on September 9th, when soldiers were ordered to lay down their arms. Instead, the Italian people took up those weapons and bravely confronted the German tanks. Thousands of soldiers and civilians opted to retreat into the mountains rather than serve under German command, inspired by the courageous examples of Russian and Balkan partisans preparing for guerrilla tactics. The struggle in Italy against Nazi Germany symbolized the yearning for complete political and social freedom. This war wasn't sparked by formal diplomacy, but rather by the sacrifices of heroes who risked their lives every day, shaping the course of history. In Turin, a female partisan observed the rise of popular resistance. As the king and Badoglio fled, the youth launched an assault on the barracks, while we held a large demonstration outside the Chamber of Labor, where workers demanded arms and brandished signs proclaiming "Turn Turin into Stalingrad." This was the true mobilization of the working class. The battle against both Salo and the Wehrmacht added a distinct duality to the mass struggle, representing both a fight for national liberation and a genuine civil war for class freedom. The conditions in Italy were set for this transformation. Unlike France, where the Nazi retreat was so sudden that resistance movements struggled to gain a foothold before the Allies arrived, it took Anglo-American forces from September 1943 to April 1945 to reach Italy's northern borders. A British diplomat lamented that the slow advancement of the Allies beneficially contributed to the establishment of an independent government in the north. Italy's People's War merged the efforts of industrial workers with armed resistance, showcasing a courage not seen in Germany or Austria. Valiani from the Action Party pointed out that when the movement surprised the Germans, they were willing to compromise. However, if the struggle stayed limited to one city, the Gestapo could focus their resources, raiding and deporting not just individuals, but also members of the makeshift committees they had previously dealt with, alongside anyone suspected of dissent. Paradoxically, the widespread strikes across various locations offered a layer of protection. Milan became the hub for the Committee for National Liberation, taking cues from Turin by launching a traditional strike under German occupation. Workers demanded substantial pay increases, doubled rations, and essentials like oil and sugar. They called for no layoffs, an end to the curfew, and the removal of Nazis from their workplaces. The strike started on December 10, 1943, swiftly bringing the Lombard capital to a halt. While employers like Pirelli agreed to a 30% pay hike, others stated they would only consider the demands with the approval of General Zimmermann, the German commander, who told the workers to return to their jobs. As the workers stood firm, the SS started rounding them up, which led to a pressing new demand: the release of those who had been arrested. General Zimmermann made vague commitments, but the strikers remained steadfast, declaring, "On to complete victory. Your threats do not scare us. Just give us what we demand, and we will return to work." At the Breda Funk Works, the local situation was revealing. The boss assembled the 6,000 workers to announce he would meet their demands and free the detained individuals, asking if they would come back the next day. The response was a firm no. Perplexed, management proposed that the workers choose representatives to talk to General Zimmermann, but initially, no one volunteered. Eventually, a delegation formed but insisted they would only negotiate with management, not the Nazis, a demand that went unheeded. When the delegation reached the Breda plant, the bosses were nowhere to be found, and Germans blocked the exits, attempting to negotiate. To ultimately suppress the citywide strike, the Nazis proposed pay increases of 40 to 50% along with improved rations, yet the workers held their ground. Armored cars moved through the factories of Milan, while soldiers attempted to coax people back to work, but their efforts were largely futile. The strike persisted for a week, but those participating emphasized that the decision to end it was entirely theirs, not compelled by the Nazis. Workplace resistance was merely one facet of the people's struggle. In the cities, communist-led groups and squads were in action, while in the countryside, experienced anti-fascists, many veterans of the Spanish Civil War, led partisan units alongside soldiers who had fled into the mountains to escape the Germans. Similar to the French resistance, recruitment surged due to Nazi-fascist crackdowns and the death penalty targeting draft dodgers. One young man's diary captured the difficult choices faced by many, stating, "What am I to do? Present myself? Not a chance. So here I am, 22, on the run, fearing whether I'll be shot or need to hide in the woods." Despite his mother being taken hostage, he chose a path of arming himself and seizing anything that could support the fight. In Pavia, half of those summoned didn't report. The impact of the partisans is backed by numerous accounts. Allied commander General Alexander estimated that 6 out of 25 Wehrmacht divisions were diverted to confront them. From the German perspective, Kesselring, the representative in Italy, expressed frustration that once unlimited guerrilla warfare commenced in June 1944, the 200,000 to 300,000 partisans posed a significant threat to German forces and played a vital role in the campaign. He considered neutralizing this danger of utmost importance, recognizing that combating both regular enemies and partisan groups was equally crucial, requiring the best troops available. The guerrillas claimed to have executed over 5,000 surprise actions, engaged in 218 battles, destroyed 458 locomotives, blown up 356 bridges, and conducted over 5,000 sabotage operations targeting power lines and communication, while also killing tens of thousands of enemy troops. This guerrilla strategy in the People's War sharply contrasted with imperialist combat methods. When Giovanni Pesce, a partisan, approached the Royal Army for weapons, an officer questioned him about his rank. Pesce was shocked. Even after the complete failure on September 8th and the ensuing partisan uprising, this man remained steadfast in his belief in a rigid hierarchy. Another partisan expressed frustration over the divide between officers and troops, highlighting that their formations were deeply rooted in absolute democracy. They simply couldn't grasp the idea of an officer's mess. An officer in the Garibaldini shared everything, food, shelter, and warmth, equally with the other soldiers. This lack of understanding went both ways. General Cadorna was sent north to lead the partisans in the king's name, and was surprised by their political engagement and the way some units elected their officers by consensus. Financial issues also sparked unrest. For GAP leader Scischetti, the thought of earning any money was distasteful. He abhorred the idea of being paid for his role as a partisan. Despite not having seen a lira in 6 months, he always found a way to survive without relying on market forces. Partisan leaders typically rejected higher salaries because they were involved in a people's war, fought by volunteers fueled by deep patriotic emotions. Unlike conventional or conscripted armies, where political discussions are generally frowned upon, the partisans were both a pioneering alternative state and a militia. In August 1944, different partisan groups united to proclaim that the partisan army was not merely a smaller replica of the traditional military structure. It represented an independent movement ignited by the people's will, making a clear statement about their political aspirations. The fight against the Nazi-fascist forces was just the initial step towards our larger goal, a radical change in our country's political, moral, and social fabric. We were striving for democracy, genuine freedom, justice, and the dignity that every individual deserves. These ideals became tangible as the Axis forces were expelled from entire regions. Soon, 15 partisan republics sprang up in places like Carnia, Montefiorino, and Ossola. Their local administrations sharply contrasted with those of Salo or Badoglio. In Varzi, for example, mass assemblies elected a new government free of fascists through direct democracy. Observers noted the wide range of individuals interacting at the town hall. Peasants applying for permits, claiming their share of requisitioned goods, or raising concerns, all from different social classes. Requisitions were paid for with goods or partisan currency, which could be traded once the nation was freed. This financial approach flourished in the Republic of the Val d'Ossola, where crime disappeared. A popular university was established for all social classes. Italy's first female minister was appointed, and trade unions were restored. It's been said that this region was the only significant part of Hitler's occupied Europe to achieve real independence and gain recognition from Switzerland. The partisans were hopeful that the Republic would receive considerable support from abroad, especially since its capital, Domodossola, was close to Milan, which could act as a strategic base for an Anglo-American attack. However, the Allied representative rejected this idea, saying, "You can't act like you're in charge of military operations, like Alexander and Eisenhower." Another diplomat noted that the Republic's existence was a challenge not just to the Italian government in Rome, but also to the Italian army. A partisan leader expressed frustration, stating that the Allies' indifference towards the efforts in Domodossola created a deep sense of bitterness. Without assistance, the Republic was ultimately crushed in just 6 days of intense fighting. The debate around attentism revealed further divides between the two conflicts. Some advocated for an immediate uprising, while others preferred to wait for help from imperialist forces. The attentists argued, "Attacking the Germans is futile. We lack the strength to succeed, and our actions would lead to severe reprisals against us and the civilian population." Battaglia criticized this viewpoint, insisting that how can the resistance grow stronger if it remains completely inactive? Moreover, the attentists neglected that, for local, national, emotional, and logical reasons, fighting the Germans had become absolutely essential. A push for independent action arose from the Allies' refusal to acknowledge Italy's rights as an Axis power. Churchill's foreign minister was outraged when the Italians replaced Marshal Badoglio, declaring, "A nation that has surrendered unconditionally has no right to offer the Allies a self-selected government." Britain was not there to liberate Italy. As Radio London pointed out, the liberation of the peninsula is not and cannot be the ultimate aim of the Allies. It was simply a way to beat Germany. This viewpoint led to comments about Italy undergoing two occupations: the Allies in the south, supported by a fascist king, and the Germans in the north, backing Mussolini's Salo Republic. In essence, attentism was about deciding between accepting Nazi fascism or succumbing to Allied imperialism through the Allied military government of occupied territories. The true option was to fight for freedom. This struggle often surfaced through mass strikes. In the spring of 1944, 500,000 workers halted their work in the largest stoppage of the war, partly aiming to convince the Allies that intense bombing was unwarranted. Another key issue was the notion of terrorism. Should partisans go after individual Nazis, risking retaliation against hostages or civilians, or should they hold back and wait for the Anglo-Americans? A notorious incident underscored the peril of such actions when 32 SS guards were killed in Rome, prompting the Nazis to execute 335 Italian hostages in retaliation. For those inclined toward attentism, this harsh collective punishment highlighted the need for caution, leading some peasants to turn against the partisans out of fear of backlash. The guerrillas were aware of these worries and had methods to address them. Valiani, linked to the Justice and Liberty partisans, explained that urban terrorism aimed to avoid collective punishment while encouraging young people to join the movement. While Axis troops were at the front, urban terrorism did not target enemy soldiers. Instead, it focused on the oppressive systems of police and retribution. This tactic was seen as a form of self-defense, despite its inherent dangers. Successful operations showed that the enemy wasn't invincible. For instance, when fascist police conducted an anti-guerrilla campaign in a specific area, the Gap eliminated 17 officers, prompting 100 of the remaining 150 to flee, with some even joining forces with the partisans. Such actions proved effective as long as they didn't substitute or overshadow mass efforts like strikes. The partisans understood the importance of maintaining ties with the larger community, which provided them shelter, food, and support. This understanding helped them avoid terror tactics that might alienate the masses and leave them as mere bystanders. A vivid example of this united effort took shape in February 1944, when the Germans sought to move labor and machinery from Italy to aid their war campaign, prompting the resistance to strongly declare, "Not a single machine, not a single worker must go to Germany." To achieve this, workers would be backed by armed defense squads and partisan groups who would continually disrupt and sabotage communications with Germany. A powerful message came from a Nazi hostage: "Don't give up the fight. My situation shouldn't hold you back. If I survive, I survive. If I must die, I will be fulfilling my destiny. What matters is that you never concede." Any concerns about employing terrorism as a strategy in the People's War seemed trivial when compared to the harsh, indiscriminate bombings chosen by the Allies. Regardless of the debate's validity, caution worked in favor of the Allied imperialist agenda. On November 10, 1944, General Alexander, leader of the Allied forces in Italy, announced that his troops would not advance that winter and urged the partisans to stand down, cease their offensive actions, go home, and await further orders. This announcement significantly affected morale. The guerrillas were battling worsening weather against vast Nazi-fascist armies now free to attack them. Longo, the top communist in the resistance, saw Alexander's decision as an effort by Allied command to weaken the Italian liberation movement. In Alexander's defense, some argued that the German Gothic Line defenses were impenetrable and that Allied commanders had no political motives. They were solely focused on the partisans' safety. However, Bahan finds it strange that Alexander's announcement wasn't made in code, as was standard practice, and it was even more concerning that resistance leaders weren't consulted or informed in advance, suggesting that the partisans paused their operations in North Italy, filled with German and fascist troops, showed a lack of understanding of the ongoing deportations to Germany and the daily oppression faced by the people. The guerrillas responded by stating, "The partisan war is not a mere whim or trivial desire for the Italian people and patriots who have taken up arms. It arose from the urgent need to defend our material, moral, and social heritage. This is the primary cause for which we have fought and will fight every single day." the war must go on. Whether Alexander was motivated by politicians' disregard for Italian self-liberation or just military concerns, this episode highlights the dual nature of the conflict. While workers played a crucial role in Italy, the People's War transcended mere class issues. The clever northern employers recognized that severe clashes with labor could draw Nazi intervention, risking the transfer of their workers and factories to Germany. To prevent this, they offered concessions and protected their workforce. Bihan points out how Fiat was adept at ducking and weaving. Even while producing tanks and rocket parts for Germany, it kept ties with U.S. intelligence and contributed significant funds to the CLN. The resistance leader at Fiat Mirafiori understood that his employers were willing to maneuver in various directions to prioritize their primary goal, profit. In a quest for national unity, the Italian resistance brought together diverse parties representing distinct class interests. The day after the armistice, on September 8, 1943, 5 major political parties, Communists, Socialists, Action Party, Christian Democrats, and Liberals, joined forces to create the Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale Alta Italia. Local committees quickly sprang up, followed by the formation of a centralized military organization, the Volunteers for Liberty Corps, to manage partisan efforts. The bond between leadership and the grassroots in this People's War was complex, with the most significant interactions occurring under the PCI's influence. Although numbers vary, it's clear that the PCI was the dominant force. Spriano notes that in the early days, 80 to 90% of political detainees were communists. As the mass anti-fascist movement gained traction, the PCI's influence remained firm. By October 1944, about 5/8 of the partisans belonged to the communist-led Garibaldi brigades, and 60% of those who fell in battle were connected to communist groups. Even rivals recognized the numerical strength of the communists, with Valiani from the Action Party estimating that 41% of partisans were aligned with the Garibaldini, compared to 29% in his Justice and Liberty formations. The PCI's membership exploded from 6,000 at the war's outset to 1,800,000 by its end. This movement from the working class even shaped the views of its political rivals. Olivelli, leader of the Catholic Green Flame partisans, declared that the era of capitalism, which amassed great wealth while inflicting deep suffering, is coming to a close. An unfeeling system has fostered rampant poverty, diminished the productivity of the people, and encouraged inhumanity. It glorified power and violence, leading to tyranny and oppression, ultimately devouring itself in the turmoil of war. From the ashes of this era, a new one is rising, one led by the working class, marked by increased justice, fraternity, and Christian principles. Although the PCI aimed to meet the needs of the People's War through its working class foundation, its leaders struggled with opposing pressures. Following the fascist crackdown in 1926, many were forced into exile in places like France and Russia, losing touch with their members. A scholar pointed out that in numerous towns and villages, many had been disconnected from the party for years. Under Palmiro Togliatti's leadership, the party was swayed by Stalinist ideology. Togliatti sought to organize and steer the spontaneous struggles into more structured groups such as the CLNs, CLNAI, and CVL. This push for centralization was partly a reaction to wartime demands, which required better coordination as conflict escalated. Yet this approach also fit the agenda of PCI leadership. The need for a democratic foundation and the centralizing demands of armed conflict weren't entirely at odds. They could actually enhance one another. Still, the People's War often conflicted with centralization, influenced by Togliatti's alignment with Russian foreign policy. A significant moment occurred in March 1944 when Togliatti accepted a role in Badoglio's cabinet, a surprising shift that shocked many. Just months earlier, at a PCI conference in Bari, strong condemnation of Badoglio had been voiced, with the PCI newspaper Unità sarcastically questioning how a government frightened of its own people could lead a people's war. During the fascist period, the PCI suffered greatly under leaders like Badoglio and the King. Now, Togliatti proclaimed the need for the working class to shift away from its previous opposition and critique. Brouet insightfully noted that this Salerno turn appeared to reflect foreign Stalinist influence, attempting to impose its will on the authentic party in Italy. Togliatti's approach was in line with the agreements reached at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt divided Europe into different areas of influence. As Italy fell under the Anglo-American sphere, the resistance had to be compromised to uphold a deal that granted Russia control over Eastern Europe. This change affected the PCI's role in the resistance, shifting from class struggle to a focus on national unity, which meant teaming up with business leaders, the monarchy, former fascists, and those who didn't openly support the Nazis. The May 1944 edition of the PCI's guerrilla newspaper, Il Combattente, emphasized that any arguments about our desired regime had to wait until after victory. This sharply contrasted with statements made just 6 months earlier, stressing the importance of addressing the immediate needs of workers and peasants linked to armed struggle. Many grassroots activists felt that Togliatti's decision was a betrayal, leading to confusion, particularly among those who had endured years in prison. Even prominent figures like Amendola recognized that while the Central Committee pushed for national unity, most of their contacts were confused or disagreed with this direction. Scacciamaro deemed Togliatti's position entirely inappropriate and hoped it wouldn't be repeated. Meanwhile, the Action Party, which had been more middle-class and moderate than the PCI, started to move to the left of the PCI. Valiani initially dismissed reports of the Salerno turn as false and pointed out how Mussolini's Republic of Salo happily depicted the PCI as betraying itself to royal interests. The Action Party cautioned Togliatti that he risked splitting the anti-fascist movement. One effect of the Salerno turn was the emergence of revolutionary factions outside the PCI that called for an international class struggle. By June 1944, the Stella Rossa group, which accused the PCI of betraying the working class to align with the bourgeoisie, had matched the PCI in membership in the crucial industrial city of Turin. Similarly, Bandiera Rossa boasted more fighters in Rome than the PCI. This faction believed that the PCI had forfeited its claim to communism. However, Togliatti held a significant edge due to his ties with the USSR and its Red Army, which was currently pushing back against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. As Russian troops approached the Flossenburg concentration camp, a captured Garibaldini inmate shared that he heard a tremendous roar, likening the sound of the cannons to Stalin's voice. Another prisoner, connected to the Action Party, expressed disappointment at being freed by American soldiers instead of by the Red Army. Togliatti's shift in perspective gained credibility, as many believed that Russia represented actually existing socialism. Graffiti affirmed that the USSR was truly an ally to the low-income and working-class people. Before Togliatti's drastic pivot, the bosses were seen as vampires sucking the life from labor, these profiteers of war and German occupancy. Now, bolstered by Soviet backing, the PCI leadership urged Italians to come together with industrialists, intellectuals, priests, ex-fascists. No one was excluded. Consequently, those who brandished clenched fists or wore symbols like the hammer and sickle had to be handled harshly and made to conform to the party's stance. In exchange for financial support, the resistance agreed to the Rome Protocols, stipulating that as the enemy withdrew, all partisan groups would operate under the direct authority of the Allied Commander-in-Chief and adhere to any directives from him or the Allied military government, including disbanding and surrendering their weapons when necessary. The PCI leadership faced constraints on how far they could lean to the right, as they still had to address their members' concerns, navigate rival political factions, and maintain their influence in the post-war environment. Party members represented a minority, and partisans were not just mindless followers. The channels of communication and command were fragile, and the official hierarchy often clashed with the chaotic realities of combat. The PCI retained some radical rhetoric, with Togliatti still calling for an insurrection, but stressing that it would focus on national liberation rather than on socialism or communism to combat fascism. The PCI also resisted passivity and opposed the Allies' attempts to suppress the partisans. It encouraged the establishment of CLNs in every village, district, and factory. This formal organization served multiple goals: It contested the AMGOT and the royal government, allowed for top-down management, and helped to coordinate a more effective grassroots campaign. However, a tense relationship persisted between popular war efforts and the imperialist influences within the resistance. By April 1945, the Allied offensive was poised to push northward. During this time, the CLNAI issued Directive No. 16, calling for a national uprising. Aware of the situation, it cautioned that the Allies might not provide the expected support. Nevertheless, it proclaimed that partisan groups would target and dismantle Nazi-fascist command centers and liberate cities, towns, and villages, and would initiate a general strike, marking the peak of the people's long struggle for freedom and their steadfast determination. In the last month of Italy's liberation, these two approaches to warfare worked together, with Allied troops advancing from the front while partisans operated behind enemy lines. Major general strikes rocked the northern industrial cities, thwarting German strategies for a scorched earth policy intended to destroy the region's infrastructure. Yet the distinction between the two methods of warfare persisted. A key moment was the liberation of Genoa, as noted by Basil Davidson, a British liaison officer who worked with the partisans. Genoa, an essential port city in the industrial triangle with Milan and Turin, housed over 15,000 heavily armed German troops in April 1945. In a tactic similar to von Scholz's in Paris, General Meinhold suggested designating Genoa as an open city in exchange for allowing the Wehrmacht to withdraw unimpeded. On April 23rd, the CLN decided to confront Meinhold's forces directly. At this time, the partisans consisted of about 6,000 fighters. Lacking adequate support from the Allies, most were poorly equipped. Despite this, they managed to keep the Nazis at bay, and on April 25th, 9,000 German soldiers surrendered without conditions. 2 days later, 7,000 tried to escape but ultimately surrendered to just 300 SAP fighters. The CLN had liberated Genoa. Shortly after, the U.S. Army, represented by General Almond, arrived. Unable to speak Italian, he relayed his message to the CLN leadership through Davidson, saying, "Tell them my troops have liberated their city, and they are free men." A quiet fell over the gathering, hanging in the air. The general looked confused, unsure if he needed assistance with the language. Davidson, who had fought alongside the partisans and understood their accomplishments, hesitated to convey Almond's words. Then, from outside that room, a loud uproar broke out. We hurried to the balcony that overlooked the street and saw a thick crowd drawing near. As they got closer, we recognized it as a group of German prisoners, marching without weapons in formation, accompanied by armed partisans. We went back to the salon, and General Almond looked at me thoughtfully and simply said, "All right." The events in Genoa resonated throughout northern Italy in different ways. Despite General Alexander's unfortunate comments and the limited supply of weapons, mainly to the attentists, the resistance played a vital role in the liberation. Ironically, it would be disarmed not by the Germans, but from within. The working class often led the way, yet the party they supported chose to revert to capitalist norms. On the day Genoa was freed, General Almond couldn't ignore the efforts of the CLN, but soon after, Davidson received new orders to pass along from a British brigadier. Inform them that this committee will be dissolved tomorrow. Their functions will cease, and all responsibilities will be taken over by AMGOT. However, the Anglo-Americans lacked the power to enforce their demands. The stern Ligurians listened quietly. They had been expecting this moment, which was a major factor in their uprising and why they were successful. And they were right. What the CLN anticipated proved accurate, as did the insights from other CLNs. AMGOT officers might have the support of the Allied armies, but they found it impossible to dismiss the Democratic nominees who had been appointed to important positions. The Anglo-Americans couldn't carry it out, but the political leaders could. They had made promises that had to be honored. The Democratic nominees weren't removed. Instead, they had to work against their own movement. The CLNs were pushed aside and allowed to fade away. While imperialism denied Italy's resistance the chance to fundamentally change society, its achievements still stand out and are distinctly different from the actions of Axis and Allied leaders. Despite the efforts of AMGOT, Italian capitalists, and former fascists, The People's War left a meaningful mark on Italian politics, primarily seen in the strengthened position of the PCI, which had betrayed that very movement.